Imagine imagine a pressure cooker. It just sits there on a stove. The flame underneath is completely cranked up to the absolute maximum, and the lid is clamped down so tight that the metal is actually groaning.
Right.
Inside, the steam is building, right? It's expanding. It's totally desperate for a way out, but every single valve is blocked. There's just zero release. And that image, that is exactly what India felt like in the years just following 1905.
That is a really visceral and, frankly, it's perfect analogy. The heat was the political awakening of the masses, and that clamped lid that was the British repression coming down hard.
Exactly. I mean, the peaceful protests of the early Congress had just been completely ignored. The massive Swadeshi movement, which had mobilized so many people against the partition of Bengal, was being brutally repressed by the colonial government. And suddenly you have this entirely new generation of youth. They are passionate, educated, and just utterly fed up. They were no longer willing to just write polite petitions or sit in these formal meetings. They were just done asking nicely.
They realized pretty quickly that the British just weren't listening to the scratching of pens. So they decided to make a noise that simply couldn't be ignored. They basically traded the inkwell for the bomb factory.
Yeah, it's a super pivotal, intense, and frankly, almost cinematic moment in history. We are talking about the era of bombs and pistols today. But before we light the fuse on today's discussion, I absolutely have to give a huge, huge welcome to everyone listening to this deep dive.
Yes, welcome everyone.
This deep dive is brought to you by the Simplified UPSC by PKP YouTube channel.
It is genuinely great to be here to unpack this era with you all. It's a period that, it often gets overshadowed by the later Gandhian movements, but this right here is the absolute foundation of Indian resistance.
Absolutely it is. And hey, if you are finding value in these deep dives, if we are helping you connect the dots in your UPSC preparation, I humbly ask, please subscribe to the channel. It really supports the creation of this content.
It really does.
And for those of you who are capable and want to help us keep the lights on and keep the deep research flowing, supporting us on Patreon makes a massive, massive difference.
We definitely have to give a really warm shout out to all our current supporters. You guys are the reason we can do this extensive research and bring these historical stories to life for everyone.
So please hit like on the video, share your valuable comments. We honestly read every single one of them. And a quick heads up for the really serious learners out there listening right now. Free notes with practice PYQs. Questions PYQs are available right now on our public Telegram channel.
Highly recommend checking those out.
Definitely. But if you want the full experience, like access to all videos of this series at once, plus premium notes, detailed explanations, extra PYQs, and model mains answers organized perfectly, you can join our private Telegram library.
It's basically the best way to completely streamline your study process.
Just DM us on the public Telegram channel to get started with that. Okay, mission time. Let's get into it. Today, we are doing a highly comprehensive breakdown of Chapter 13 of the Spectrum Book of Modern History. Our focus for you today is the first phase of revolutionary activities, which spans roughly from 1907 to 1917.
It is a decade that completely redefined resistance in India. We are going to cover exactly why this surge happened, the specific activities in hotbeds like Bengal, Maharashtra, and Punjab, and then we are actually going to trace the global network from London all the way to San Francisco before discussing why this specific phase eventually declined.
So let's jump right in. Segment 1, the spark. We need to understand the why here. We are looking at 1907. The Swadeshi boycott movement has been the main story for a few years at this point. It was huge. But then the energy completely shifts. What was the catalyst? Why did these young people suddenly turn to violence?
Well, to truly understand the spark, you have to understand the heartbreak of the youth. By 1908, the open phase of the Swadeshi movement was essentially dead in the water. It was rapidly declining.
Declining why exactly? Just because people were tired?
Partially fatigue, sure, but mostly because the government came down with an absolute iron hand. I mean, they passed a slew of incredibly repressive laws. They banned public meetings. They arrested the prominent leaders.
All right.
But the failure wasn't just external repression from the British. It was internal, too. The extremist leadership in the congressmen, like Tilak, Bipin Chandrapal, Lala Lajpat Rai, they'd whipped up this massive frenzy. They told the youth, sacrifice for the nation, wake up.
Yeah.
But they totally failed to build an effective, lasting organization to actually channel that awakened energy.
That sounds like a really dangerous combination. You wake people up, you get them incredibly angry and motivated, and then you basically tell them, okay, well, show's over, go back to class.
Precisely. This is what we call the youth's dilemma. Put yourself in their shoes. Imagine you are a 20-year-old student in Calcutta at that time. You've been beaten by police in a peaceful protest. You've seen your personal mentors arrested and dragged away. You can't just go back to your textbooks and pretend the British Raj is this benevolent force.
Yeah, that illusion is shattered.
Completely shattered. You are totally disillusioned with the politics of petitions that the moderates were doing, but you are also deeply frustrated by the extremists' inability to actually protect the movement they started.
So into this huge leadership vacuum comes a new logic, a much harder logic.
The logic of force. They concluded that if the British could not be expelled by a mass movement, mostly because the masses were just too heavily suppressed or by peaceful protest, then they absolutely must be expelled by physical force.
But this wasn't just some random, unorganized anger, was it? They were reading up on things. They were actively looking at the rest of the world for some sort of blueprint.
Oh, heavily. They were intellectuals, mostly students, and educated young men. They were incredibly influenced by the Russian nihilists and the Irish nationalists. They saw how the Irish were actively fighting the British using these guerrilla tactics. They saw how the Russian revolutionaries were pushing back against the Tsar. And they adopted a specific strategy that we in history call individual heroic action.
Individual heroic action. Let's really unpack that term for our listeners because it sounds almost romantic on the surface. But in hard practice, what does that actually mean?
It basically means you don't wait around for an entire army to form. You don't wait for a broad political consensus. You, as a single individual or part of a tiny secret cell, take immediate action. The goal wasn't necessarily an instant overnight revolution where the British government just magically topples.
Because they knew they didn't have the numbers for that.
Exactly. They were realists enough to know they lacked the sheer numbers and firepower for a full-scale war right then.
So if the primary goal isn't to topple the government immediately, what is the actual strategic point of using violence?
Two main things. First, they wanted to strike absolute terror into the hearts of the British bureaucracy. They specifically wanted to assassinate unpopular officials.
The cruel one.
Right, the ones who were known to be exceptionally cruel. The judges who handed out insanely harsh sentences to young boys, the police officers who actively tortured activists. And second, they also ruthlessly targeted traitors and informers within their own Indian ranks.
So it's essentially psychological warfare against the state.
It is. But the second goal is arguably even more important for UPSC students to grasp. It's a core concept called propaganda by deed.
Propaganda by deed. That is a phrase that comes up so often in history exams and mains answers. Break that down for us. What is the psychology there?
The core idea is that the Indian people at large were completely paralyzed by fear. The British Raj seemed entirely invincible to the common person, almost godlike in its overarching power. The revolutionaries firmly believed that if a young, everyday student could stand up and take down a powerful, highly guarded British magistrate, even if that student died in the process, it would completely shatter that myth of British invincibility.
Wow.
It would vividly show the masses, look, they bleed just like us, they can be hurt, they're not gods.
So the physical act of violence itself is the message. It's a transmission designed to wake the entire nation up from this colonial trance.
Yes, exactly. Its ultimate sacrifice is a public spectacle. The mindset was very much, I will willingly die right now so that you may finally lose your fear.
That is, wow, that is incredibly heavy. It's a level of personal commitment that's almost hard to wrap your head around today. So we have the core motivation laid out. We have the underlying philosophy. Now let's look at where this actually played out on the ground. Segment 2, the hotbed. We are talking about Bengal.
Bengal was absolutely the epicenter. The partition of Bengal back in 1905 had really deeply traumatized the entire region, and that collective trauma directly birthed these militant movements.
And it didn't just start with people throwing bombs, did it? It started with something that looked much more innocent on the surface. Gyms, right?
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
We have to talk about the Anushilan Samiti. This is a crucial organization to remember. It was founded by Pramotha Mitter, and it included key figures like Jatindranath Banerjee and Barindra Kumar Ghosh. Initially, these groups, and honestly, there were many, many secret societies honeycombing the entire student community in Calcutta. They were focused strictly on physical and moral training.
Which sounds a bit like a Boy Scout troop if you just look at the charter.
Right. On the surface, it looks like a fitness club. They taught lathe play, basic sword fighting, boxing, wrestling. But the true underlying purpose was to deliberately build a generation of young men who were physically and mentally capable of actually fighting the British in hand-to-hand combat.
They were building a shadow army in plain sight.
They were. But around 1906, their patience completely ran out. The physical training wasn't enough anymore. An inner circle within the Anushilan Samiti, which was led by Birendra Kumar Ghosh and Bhupendranath Dutta, who was Swami Vivekananda's brother, by the way, which is an interesting connection, they decided it was time to officially move from training to direct action.
And they launched a very specific newspaper to announce this massive shift, the famous Yugantar.
Yugantar was a crucial turning point, and it wasn't subtle in the slightest. It advocated revolutionary violence entirely openly. There is a very famous quote from Yugantar published in 1906 that basically sums up the entire sentiment perfectly. It said, "The remedy lies with the people. The 30 crore people inhabiting India must raise their 60 crore hands to stop this curse of oppression. Force must be stopped by force."
Force must be stopped by force. I mean, that is a literal declaration of war printed in a weekly paper. And they started acting on it almost immediately, right?
They absolutely did. In 1907, there was a major attempt on the life of Sir Fuller. He was the very first lieutenant governor of the newly created province of Eastern Bengal and Assam. He was an intensely unpopular figure because of his incredibly harsh repressive measures against local student protests.
And then they also went for the physical infrastructure of the Raj.
Yes, December 1907. There's a coordinated attempt to derail the actual train carrying the lieutenant governor, Sri Andrew Fraser. They were actively trying to wreck the physical machinery of the state, quite literally.
But the incident that really, truly captured the public imagination and unfortunately tragic infamy was the Muzaffarpur incident in 1908. For our listeners, this is the story that pretty much every child in Bengal grows up hearing. The story of Khudiram Bose and Prafulla Chaki.
This is a really heartbreaking story in many ways. It perfectly encapsulates both the immense idealism and the profound tragedy of the entire movement. Khudiram Bose and Prafulla Chaki, two very young men, were explicitly tasked with assassinating a man named Kingsford.
Why Kingsford specifically? What had he done to end up on the radar?
Kingsford was serving as a magistrate in Muzaffarpur at the time, but right before that, he had been stationed in Calcutta. And in Calcutta, he was notorious, absolutely hated for handing out incredibly harsh, cruel sentences to very young Swadeshi activists. This included corporal punishment, like public flogging of teenage boys. He was a deeply hated figure, a prime textbook target for that propaganda by deed we talked about.
So these two young guys, and Khudiram was what, barely 18 years old?
Yeah.
They travel all the way to Muzaffarpur. They track this guy down.
They staked him out. They watched his daily routine for days. On the evening of April 30th, 1908, they saw a specific carriage leaving the European Club. They firmly believed Kingsford was inside that carriage. They ran up to it in the dark and threw a bomb directly into it.
But it didn't go as planned.
No, they made a terrible, fatal mistake. Kingsford wasn't actually in that carriage. Instead, two completely innocent European women, the Kennedys, a mother and her daughter, were inside, and they were killed in the blast.
That is just deeply tragic. They set out to kill a symbol of colonial oppression and ended up taking the lives of two innocent civilians. What ended up happening to the boys after the blast?
The police manhunt was massive and immediate. Prafulla Chaki was eventually cornered by the police at the Cama railway station, and rather than be captured and most likely brutally tortured for information, he chose to shoot himself. He committed suicide right there on the platform.
And Khudiram, he was caught, right?
Yes, Khudiram Bose was arrested shortly after. He was put on trial and quickly sentenced to death by hanging. But the way he actually faced his trial and his execution, he was incredibly, almost unnervingly calm. Reports say he literally walked to the gallows with a smile on his face.
Wow.
He was hanged. And despite the completely botched nature of the attack and the tragic deaths of the women, his personal bravery and his death turned him into an absolute folk hero across India. Songs are written about his sacrifice, songs like Ekbar Bide Dima, which are literally still sung in Bengal today.
It's that propaganda by deed actually working, even working through a massive tactical failure. His sheer bravery sort of masked the terrible error of the bombing itself.
Exactly. The public focused on his sacrifice, not the mistake. But practically speaking, for the movement itself, the bombing was a total disaster. The resulting police investigation into the Muzaffarpur bombing completely blew the lid off the entire network of secret societies.
Because the police traced the bomb components right back to Calcutta, right?
As it led directly to what we know as the Alipore conspiracy case. The police raided the main headquarters of the group at Manikala Gardens in Calcutta. They found a fully functioning bomb factory. They arrested the prominent Ghosh brothers Aurobindo and Birendra and many, many others. It was a massive, sweeping crackdown by the state.
And what happened to the leaders?
Well, Aurobindo Ghosh was eventually acquitted, largely thanks to a brilliant legendary legal defense by Chittaranjan Das, but the experience changed him. He completely retired from active politics after this and moved to Pondicherry to become a spiritual leader. Birendra, on the other hand, was deported.
So the top leadership in Bengal is essentially decapitated by the British. But the Hydra just grows more heads, doesn't it? The movement evolves, and here's where the history gets really interesting. We move from localized, homemade bombs to actual international intrigue. The famous German plot and a man named Bhagat
Jatindranath Mukherjee, universally known as Bhagat Jatan. Legend has it, he actually killed a fully grown Bengal tiger with nothing but a knife, which is where the name Baga or tiger comes from. This specific phase brings us right into the context of the First World War.
Right, because up until now, we're talking about very localized actions, homemade explosives, single targets, but then 1914 hits and the entire world goes to war. How did the Indian revolutionaries view WWI?
They viewed it as a literal heaven-sent opportunity. It was the old political adage in action. England's difficulty is India's opportunity. Britain was entirely distracted fighting for its life, defending against Germany. The vast bulk of the trained British Indian Army was actively shipped off to fight in the trenches in Europe and the Middle East.
So India was left relatively unguarded by British troops.
Exactly. India was vulnerable.
So they applied the enemy of my enemy is my friend's logic with Germany.
They did. The plan they cooked up was incredibly ambitious. It wasn't just about single assassinations anymore. Bhagat Jatan and his unified group wanted to actively coordinate with the German government to receive massive shipments of modern military arms and ammunition. They wanted to launch a full-scale, nationwide armed insurrection.
This is a huge leap in military strategy. We are talking about actual guerrilla warfare now, not just terror tactics.
Yes, conventional warfare. They planned to systematically disrupt the railways, cut all the telegraph lines to blind the British administration, seize Fort William in Calcutta by force, and essentially isolate the entire province of Bengal for the rest of the British Empire.
Yeah.
This whole grand strategy was known as the Zimmermann Plan.
That is wild. So where did it all go wrong? Because obviously they didn't take Fort William.
Jatin and his core group went to the eastern coast of Orissa, to a remote place called Balasore. They were there to wait for a specific German ship called the Maverick, which was supposed to be loaded with the guns and drop them off. But the British intelligence network was extremely good. They had intercepted the coded communications between the Germans and the Indians. The British knew the entire plot.
Oh, man. So they were sitting on a beach waiting for a ship that was never, ever going to come.
Precisely. And instead of a German ship, heavily armed British police arrived. Jatan and his close associates had to flee into the dense countryside. They were eventually tracked down to a dry riverbed in Balasore in September of 1915.
And this leads directly to the famous Battle of Balasore.
It was a literal pitched shootout. 5 Indian revolutionaries armed with a few Mauser pistols against a fully equipped, heavily armed British police force. And they fought them for hours. Jatan was severely wounded in the gunfight and died in the local hospital shortly after.
He did surrender, though, right?
Never. Not once. His most famous motto, which defined his life, was, "We shall die to awaken the nation." And in many ways, that heroic final stand at Balasore became totally legendary across India. It proved to the people that Indians could actually fight a pitched tactical battle against the mighty British police and hold their ground.
We shall die to awaken the nation. That quote really just perfectly highlights that intense sacrificial mindset again. They clearly knew the tactical odds were against them. They knew they might not survive that riverbed, but they deeply hoped their dramatic death would spark something much greater in the public consciousness.
Exactly. It connects right back to that core idea of removing public fear. If these 5 guys could fight and die so bravely, the average citizen on the street might finally stop fearing the local British constable.
So true. Let's shift our gaze a bit now. That was the fire raging in the east, in Bengal. But the fire was definitely burning in the west, too. Segment 3, the Western Front, focusing on Maharashtra.
Maharashtra is super interesting for UPSC students to study because it actually has some of the very earliest instances of this specific kind of militant thinking. We actually have to go back in time a bit, even before the Swadeshi movement, all the way back to 1879.
Wait, 1879? That's just a couple of decades after the massive 1857 revolt settled down. Who exactly are we talking about here?
We are talking about a man named Vasudev Balwant Phadke. In many historical circles, he's often referred to as the true father of armed struggle in India.
Why 1879 specifically? What was the socioeconomic situation happening then to trigger this?
Famine. Brutal famine. The entire Deccan region was reeling under a severe, prolonged famine, and the British administration was behaving as they usually did, with complete callous indifference to Indian suffering. Hodke was a government clerk, but he was deeply, deeply moved by the horrific suffering of the local peasants. So he took action and organized something called the Ramosi Peasant Force.
A literal peasant army.
Yes. His core idea was to severely disrupt British communication lines and, crucially, to raise funds for a wider rebellion through targeted dacoities, essentially robbing wealthy British sympathizers and the government treasuries to fund the coming revolution. It was a very early, very raw attempt to create an indigenous armed force to drive out the British. He was eventually caught and actually died in a colonial prison in Aden, but he firmly set a precedent for Maharashtra.
And then jumping forward, of course, you have the absolute towering figure of Bal Gangadhar Tilak. We generally know him as a major extremist leader within the formal Congress, but his background influence on these young underground revolutionaries in Maharashtra was absolutely massive, wasn't it?
Oh, it was huge. Tilak provided the essential intellectual and cultural framework for the violence. He cleverly realized that while the British quickly banned overt political gatherings, they absolutely couldn't ban traditional religious festivals without risking a massive, uncontrollable uprising. So he deliberately reorganized the local Ganapati and Shivaji festivals.
That is just political genius. You come for the religious prayer, but you stay for the radical politics.
Exactly that. He brilliantly used these massive public festivals to actively propagate a very militant, assertive form of nationalism. He deliberately linked modern patriotism with deep religious fervor and a strong historical pride in the old Maratha Empire. Furthermore, his wildly popular journals, Kesari and Maharata, were just constantly educating the youth on their absolute duty to the nation. He famously wrote an article detailing how Shivaji killed Afzal Khan, essentially using history to justify using violence for a righteous national cause.
And that highly charged atmosphere inevitably bred action. We have to talk about the famous Chapekar brothers now.
Right, this happened in 1897. Again, the specific local context is crucial here for your notes. It wasn't just some abstract, high-level nationalism driving them. There was a horrific bubonic plague epidemic raging in Pune at the time. Ordinary people were literally dying in the streets.
And how did the government respond to the plague? I'm guessing not well.
Heavy-handed is a massive understatement. The British appointed a plague commissioner, a man named Mr. Rand. And Rand deployed actual armed British soldiers to strictly enforce brutal quarantine measures.
Soldiers, not doctors.
Exactly. And these foreign soldiers were forcibly entering private Indian homes, dragging sick women out into the streets, completely violating personal privacy, deeply offending strict religious and caste sentiments, and generally treating the traumatized population like infected cattle. There was massive boiling public outrage across Pune.
So it wasn't just the fear of the disease, it was the intense, degrading humiliation of the government's response to it.
Precisely. So two brothers, Damodar and Balkrishna Chapekar, they decided they had to avenge this deep humiliation of their people. On the night of the Queen's Diamond Jubilee celebrations, of all nights, they successfully assassinated Commissioner Rand and his military escort, Lieutenant Ayerst.
That must have completely shocked the British establishment.
It definitely did. It is widely considered the very first overtly political assassination of a British official in this entire modern era. The Chapekar brothers were caught and hanged, but they became instant revered martyrs in Maharashtra.
And moving into the early 1900s, the revolutionary baton is passed to a name that still evokes incredibly strong, often polarized reactions even today, Vinayak Damodar Savarkar.
Savarkar is undeniably a key central architect of the entire revolutionary network in Maharashtra. He was incredibly brilliant and highly organized. In 1899, he and his brother Ganesh organized the secret society called Mitra Mela. Later on, around 1904, this group evolved and merged into a larger organization called Abhinav.
Abhinav. That directly translates to Young India or Modern India, right? Interestingly, it was named specifically after Giuseppe Mazzini's group, Young Italy, correct, showing that deep international influence once again.
Yes, exactly. Savarkar was absolutely obsessed with Mazzini, the great Italian revolutionary. He actually wrote a full biography of him in Marathi. These Indian youths were hungrily reading about the Italian unification movement, about how dedicated secret societies successfully liberated nations in Europe. They actively wanted to replicate that exact same covert structure right here in India.
And this specific group, Abhinav, was directly involved in the massive Nasik conspiracy.
That's the major defining event here. In 1909, A.M.T. Jackson, who was the British collector of Nasik, was shot and killed. The young man who pulled the trigger was Anna Lashman Kanhir, who was a dedicated member of Abhinav.
Now, Jackson, he wasn't like Rand, was he? He wasn't particularly known for cruelty or oppression?
No, ironically, Jackson was actually a renowned Indologist. He deeply studied ancient Indian culture, he spoke the languages, and he was generally seen by the British as a good and sympathetic official.
So why target him? Why kill the good guy?
It firmly shows that the revolutionaries were now targeting the position itself and the entire colonial system, not just the individuals who were personally cruel. Although, to be accurate, the immediate trigger for the assassination was that Jackson had recently committed a local patriot trial for writing subversive songs. But the killing of Jackson completely blew the lid off the entire Abhinav conspiracy.
The resulting police investigation went really deep, didn't it?
It uncovered everything. It revealed a massive, interconnected network of bomb manufacturers and arms caches spread across Nasik, Pune, and Bombay. And crucially for Savarkar, the police found that the specific Browning pistols used in Jackson's murder had actually been smuggled in and sent by Savarkar all the way from London.
Wow. And this is exactly where Savarkar gets fully caught up in the brutal legal machinery of the Raj.
Yes. The extensive investigation concluded that Savarkar was the ultimate moving spirit and mastermind behind the entire conspiracy. He was arrested and extradited from London to face trial in India. This journey actually led to his incredibly famous daring escape attempt at Marseille, where he literally squeezed through and jumped out of the ship's toilet porthole into the ocean to seek asylum in France. But he was unlawfully recaptured by British guards. He was brought to India, tried, and sentenced to transportation for life. 2 life sentences, actually, to be served consecutively. And he was sent to the infamous cellular jail in the Andaman Islands.
Kalapani. The Black Waters. That must have been a devastating, almost fatal blow to the underground movement in Maharashtra.
It essentially crushed the organized network there for a significant period of time, yes.
Okay, so we've thoroughly covered the East and the West. Now let's look north for a bit. Segment 4, revolutionary activities in Punjab. Punjab is historically known for its deep martial history. What exactly was driving the widespread unrest there around 1907?
Well, Punjab had a very different set of socioeconomic triggers compared to Bengal or Maharashtra. It was a heavily agrarian society. You had frequent devastating famines, but also very specific punitive government policies that directly hurt the local farmers. You had sharply rising land revenue demands and new, heavy irrigation taxes imposed on the vital canal colonies. And then there was the incredibly hated practice of Begar.
Begar, that's forced, unpaid labor, right?
Yes, forced labor demanded by wealthy zamindars and corrupt British officials. The peasants were hurting immensely. It was a matter of basic survival.
So it wasn't just abstract intellectual nationalism for them. It was literally, I can't feed my family because you are taxing the water I need to grow crops.
Exactly. It was deeply visceral. And prominent leaders like Lala Lajpat and Ajit Singh successfully tapped into this raw agrarian anger. Lajpat was running his influential journal called Punjabi, which had this great militant motto, self-help at any cost. Ajit Singh, who, fun fact for our listeners, is actually the famous Bhagat Singh's uncle. He organized a powerful group called the Anjumani Mohibban-e-Watan and started a very popular journal called Padapmata.
I just love that historical connection, the true revolutionary spirit literally running in the family bloodline. So Ajit Singh was out there actively urging the peasants not to pay these unjust British taxes.
Yes, he was a massive agitator. The incredibly famous, rousing slogan, Pagri Sambal Jatha, which roughly means take care of your turban or your dignity, O peasant, that actually originates directly from this specific era in his campaigns. He was highly active organizing among the Chenab colonists and the Bari Doab peasants, but the British government simply could not tolerate this economic disruption, so they struck back hard. In 1907, they summarily deported both Lala Lajpat Rai and Ajit Singh without trial.
And as we've consistently seen in this deep dive, whenever you aggressively cut off the head of the open public movement, the body politic just turns to different, much more covert methods.
Correct. The entire movement in Punjab turned significantly harder and more violent. And this is exactly where a fascinating figure named Rash Bose vividly enters the picture as a true mastermind. He was essentially a ghost. He lived up in North India, actually worked a mundane government job as a clerk at the Forest Research Institute in Dehradun, But secretly, completely under the radar, he was the crucial link connecting the underground cells in Bengal, Punjab, and the United Provinces.
And Rashpari Bose was the primary architect behind one of the absolute most audacious, unbelievable attacks of the entire era, the Delhi Conspiracy of 1912.
This event is truly mind-bogglingly daring. The British had just proudly shifted the grand capital of India from Calcutta to Delhi. To celebrate, the Viceroy, Lord Hardinge, was making this incredibly grand imperial state entry into the new capital city.
Just try to imagine the sheer scene for a second. The absolute pomp and arrogant circumstance of the British Raj at its peak. The Viceroy is literally riding on a massive decorated elephant, completely surrounded by elite guards, parading slowly down Chandni Chowk in front of thousands.
And then suddenly a bomb. A homemade bomb was hurled from a nearby building's balcony right onto the howdah of the Viceroy's elephant.
Did the bomb actually work? Did they get him?
Harding was severely injured. He was bleeding profusely, but he managed to survive the blast. The poor Mahood, the elephant driver, was killed instantly. But the political message it sent was absolutely thunderous. It proved that the Indian revolutionaries could effortlessly reach the very, very top of the British food chain, right in the beating heart of the brand new capital during the absolute most heavily secure military event possible. It showed the entire world that no British official in India was truly safe.
It honestly plays out like something straight out of an espionage thriller. And what happened to Rashpari Bose after throwing the capital into chaos?
He miraculously managed to evade capture entirely. He was an absolute master of disguise and evasion. He eventually fled India and made his way to Japan, where he actually continued to work tirelessly for Indian independence for decades. He was highly instrumental in the early formation of the Indian National Army, the INA, much later on. But in this specific 1912-1915 period, he and another leader named Sachin Sanyal were desperately trying to coordinate with the overseas Ghadar Party to launch a massive nationwide uprising in 1915.
You mentioned the Ghadar Party, and that is honestly the absolute perfect bridge to our next major section, Segment 5, Going Global. Because these dedicated revolutionaries weren't just operating in the shadows of Indian cities anymore, they were literally everywhere across the globe.
They really had to be. The draconian press acts passed in India were completely suffocating any free thought. To safely publish their radical literature, to find reliable shelter, and crucially, to secure modern weapons and learn advanced bomb-making techniques, they simply had to go abroad.
Let's start right in the absolute heart of the colonial beast, London itself.
In London, the absolute center of gravity for Indian radicals was a place called India House. It was a large, unassuming mansion located in Highgate, established by a man named Shyamji Krishnavarma. He also started a highly influential journal from there called The Indian Sociologist.
India House kind of sounds like a simple student dormitory on paper, but it was really a highly active recruiting ground for militants, wasn't it?
It was officially a scholarship center. They purposefully brought over very bright, potentially radical youth from India to London, supposedly just for higher study, but in reality it was for intense political training. Savarkar lived there, Lala lived there. They held regular Sunday meetings where they passionately discussed global revolution, openly read heavily banned books, and practically learned how to manufacture high explosives right under the noses of Scotland Yard.
And this specific radical environment is what produced Madan Lal Dhingra.
Madan Lal Dhingra, yes. In 1909, he successfully assassinated Curzon Willie. Curzon Willie was a senior bureaucrat at the India office who was actively keeping strict police surveillance on all the Indian students in London. The assassination happened right in the middle of London, at a very public social gathering.
Dhingra's formal statement to the court before his execution is widely considered one of the most powerful, chilling documents of the entire period. Do you happen to have that quote handy?
I do. It's incredibly moving. He proudly stated to the British judge, "I can offer nothing but my blood on the altar of mother's deliverance. May I be reborn of the same mother, and may I re-die in the same sacred cause till my mission is done."
Literal chills. I can offer nothing but my blood. It really, truly emphasizes the deeply spiritual, almost religious nature of their political commitment. To them, it wasn't just secular politics. It was a divine, holy duty to the motherland.
Absolutely. It was a sacred mission. But as you can imagine, London became entirely too hot for them after a public assassination of a British official. The police cracked down hard. So the major center of overseas operations shifted to mainland Europe. You had incredible figures like Madame Bhikaiji Cama operating safely out of Paris and Geneva.
Madame Cama, she's often rightfully called the mother of the Indian Revolution.
A truly formidable, brilliant woman. She bravely brought out the revolutionary journal, Bande Mataram from Europe. And remember, for your exams, she was the very first person to boldly unfurl an early version of the Indian national flag at the International Socialist Congress in Stuttgart, Germany, back in 1907. She practically put India's bloody struggle for freedom on the global diplomatic map for the first time.
And then, during the outbreak of World War I, Berlin suddenly became a massive hub for them.
Yes, the Berlin Committee, which was established by Virendranath Chattopadhyay. This directly links back to that grand Zimmermann plan we discussed earlier. They were actively, officially working with the German Foreign Office. With German funding, they sent secret missions to places like Baghdad, Persia, Turkey, and even Kabul in Afghanistan.
They actually managed to set up a provisional government of Free India in Kabul, right?
They did. Raja Mahendra Pratap Singh and Barkatullah set it up. It was largely symbolic, of course, as they had no real territory, but it clearly showed their massive global ambition. They were literally trying to geopolitically encircle British India from the outside by making alliances with Britain's enemies.
That is just fascinating. But perhaps the absolute most famous and undoubtedly most tragic of all these international revolutionary groups was based all the way in North America, the legendary Ghadar Party.
The Ghadar Party is so vital to study because its demographic composition was entirely different from the educated upper-class Bhadralok students of Bengal or the elite Brahmins of Pune.
How so? Who were the Ghadrites?
These guys generally weren't university students. These were tough, hardened Punjabi ex-soldiers and poor agrarian peasants who had desperately migrated to places like Canada and the west coast of the USA just looking for basic physical work. They were exhaustingly working in massive lumber mills on vast agricultural farms, physically laying railway tracks across the continent.
So these were very rough, tough, working-class men.
Exactly. But here's the catch they were facing: incredibly intense systemic racism and severe legal discrimination in North America. And they slowly, painfully realized that they were being treated like absolute dirt abroad simply because their home country was an enslaved colony. They had no sovereign government to protect their rights. Their fierce nationalism was directly born out of the daily racial humiliation they faced while working abroad.
And they eventually set up their main headquarters in San Francisco.
Yes, the famous Yugantar Ashram in San Francisco. The key intellectual leaders were highly educated men like Lala Hardayal Ramchandra and Barkatullah, but the actual physical muscle, the dedicated cadres, were men like the young Kartar Singh Saraba and Balan Singh.
The actual name Gadrar, it means something very specific in Urdu and Hindi, doesn't it?
Gadra translates directly to revolt or mutiny. It was deliberately named specifically after the great 1857 mutiny against the British. Their main weekly newspaper was also titled the Gadra. And listen to this. This is how bold they were. The official masthead of their widely distributed paper literally read, "Enemy of the British rule." And under the classified wanted section, it plainly stated, "Wanted. Brave soldiers for the Gadra of India. Pay. Death, price, martyrdom, pension, liberty, field of battle, India."
Wow, that is just incredible political branding. Zero false promises. Pay, death. They knew exactly what they were signing up for.
Their core strategy was incredibly direct and militant. Assassinate key British officials, continuously publish and smuggle revolutionary literature into India, actively work among Indian troops stationed in foreign colonies to turn them against their British commanders, procure massive caches of arms, and eventually spark a simultaneous massive armed revolt in all British colonies at once.
That brings us right to the infamous Komagata Maru incident in 1914. I have to say, this specific story always makes my blood absolutely boil when I read about it. It's such a pivotal, tragic moment.
It is a stark, horrific example of the racist exclusion laws of the time. The Komagata Maru was a chartered Japanese steamship carrying 376 desperate passengers, mostly poor Sikhs and some Muslims from Singapore all the way across the Pacific to Vancouver, Canada. They simply hoped to find honest work and a better new life. But when they finally arrived in Canadian waters, they were cruelly denied permission to dock by the authorities.
Wait, they were kept stranded on the ship for, what, 2 whole months?
2 excruciating months, just anchored out in the harbor, rapidly running out of basic food and fresh water, facing endless racist legal battles ashore. Eventually, the Canadian Navy literally forced them at gunpoint to turn the ship around. They were forced to sail all the way back across the ocean to India.
And when they finally exhaustedly arrived back in India at the port of Budge near Calcutta, I assume they weren't welcomed with open arms by the British authorities either.
No, absolutely not. The paranoid British government instantly viewed all these returning angry passengers as highly dangerous political agitators. They aggressively tried to force them all onto a special guarded train to immediately deport them back to Punjab. The exhausted passengers understandably resisted. There was a chaotic clash. The British police opened fire on the unarmed crowd. 18 innocent people were shot and killed right there.
18 people murdered who literally just wanted a better life and were denied at every turn. This massacre must have completely inflamed the gay rights waiting back in America.
It was the ultimate catalyst. The Budge massacre completely convinced the gay rights in America that the time for writing articles and talking was officially over. They decided to launch their massive armed revolt immediately. Thousands of dedicated gay rights literally sold their businesses and possessions in America and flooded back to Punjab to actively start the uprising.
And they actually fixed a specific date for the revolution, right?
They did. February 21st, 1915. The grand plan was to heavily trigger simultaneous armed mutinies in the major military garrisons at Firozpur, Lahore, and Rawalpindi. Leaders like Rash Bose and Sachin Sanyal were already there on the ground to lead it. They had secretly cultivated deep contacts inside the Indian Army units. It was genuinely poised to be a massive second 1857 mutiny.
But it failed. It didn't happen.
Treachery. That is the deeply sad recurring theme of this entire episode. The British police had successfully planted informers deep inside the Ghadar movement. A specific traitor named Kirpal Singh maliciously revealed the entire detailed plan to the British. The authorities suddenly knew everything, the dates, the locations, the key leaders, and they took immediate, utterly ruthless preemptive action. They rapidly disarmed the potentially rebellious Sikh regiments, arrested the top leaders before they could even draw a weapon, and to crush it completely, they hastily passed the draconian Defense of India Act in 1915.
Right, the Defense of India Act, let's pause on that. That law was incredibly draconian, wasn't it?
It was essentially martial law. It gave the colonial government completely sweeping, unchecked powers to arbitrarily detain any suspected person without a trial. Special, fast-track tribunals were set up that bypassed all normal legal procedures. Hundreds of people were summarily hanged, including the brilliant young leader Kartar Singh Sarabha, who was only 19 years old when they executed him. Hundreds more were shipped off to the cellular jail. The sheer scale of the terror basically broke the back of the Ghadar movement in Punjab entirely.
But despite all that preemptive crackdown, there was actually one place where a military mutiny did successfully happen, wasn't there? Down in Singapore.
Yes. The relatively unknown Singapore Mutiny of 1915. The 5th Light Infantry of the British Indian Army, which was a primarily Muslim unit, actually successfully mutinied. They violently took over and controlled the entire military garrison for several days. It was a massive crisis for the empire. It actually took a fierce, combined battle involving British, French, Russian, and even Japanese naval forces to finally crush these Indian rebels. Afterwards, 37 of the captured rebels were executed by firing squad publicly, and 41 were transported for life.
It just shows that the Indian military actually could be politically influenced, which was the absolute worst nightmare for the British Raj.
Exactly. The British knew that if the Indian army completely turned against them, the Raj was finished overnight. That's exactly why their repression of the Ghadrites was so incredibly swift and brutal.
Okay, so we have seen all this massive explosive activity from Bengal to Maharashtra to Punjab to the global networks. But by around 1917 or so, this entire first phase of intense revolutionary activity distinctly declines. Segment 6, decline and summary. Why did it suddenly fade out?
There are 3 main historical reasons for the decline. First, as we just discussed at length, the sheer state repression was overwhelming. The Defense of India Act of 1915 was brutally, highly effective at destroying networks. The experienced leadership was gone out. They were either hanged, like Khudiram and Kartar Singh, rotting in jail like Savarkar, or forced into permanent exile like Rash Bose and Hardial.
Right. You just can't run a coordinated revolution without your key leaders. What was the second major reason?
Political conciliation. The British were masters of playing a carrot-and-stick game. While they used the stick of the Defense of India Act in 1917, Edwin Montagu, the Secretary of State for India, made a very famous public declaration. He officially promised the gradual development of self-governing institutions for Indians. This vague promise effectively cooled down some of the high political temperature. It gave the moderate politicians something tangible to hope for and argue over, which split the public focus.
And the third, perhaps most important reason?
The arrival of a completely new phenomenon named Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. He dramatically emerged on the national political scene around 1915 and 1916 with a totally new, untested, nonviolent mass leadership technique, satyagraha. He offered a genuinely viable, active alternative to the angry youth.
That's such a key fundamental point. Before Gandhi arrived, if you were a passionate youth and you wanted to do something drastic and brave for your country, your really only option was to pick up a bomb. But Gandhi came in and said, no, wait. You can actively break the British law, you can proudly go to jail, and you can be a national hero without having to kill anyone or operate in the shadows.
Exactly. It brilliantly channeled all that massive pent-up youthful energy into the completely different, highly organized kind of open mass struggle.
So, expert, as we wrap this up, how do we historically evaluate this entire violent phase? Looking back with hindsight, was it a success or was it a failure?
Well, it's deeply complex. If you look purely at their immediate stated goal, which was driving the British out of India by armed force, it was objectively a failure. They obviously didn't achieve national independence in 1915.
Why do you think they failed in that strict operational sense?
Primarily, their active social base was far too narrow. In Bengal, for example, the revolutionaries were mostly highly educated, upper caste Bajralok youth. They completely failed to actively involve the broader masses, the poor peasants, and the factory workers in any systematic, organized way. They were structurally elitist in their secret makeup, even if they truly believed they were fighting for the common people.
And there was a significant religious issue holding them back, too, right?
Yes, especially in Bengal and Maharashtra. The very heavy, overt use of Hindu religious imagery, like taking blood oaths before the goddess Kali or swearing on the Bhagavad Gita, it completely alienated the vast Muslim population. You simply can't have a successful united national revolution if your core symbolism actively alienates a huge chunk of the nation you are trying to free.
That's a highly critical lesson for nation building. And what about their overall organization?
Even groups like the Ghadar Party, which to their immense credit was fiercely secular and incredibly valiant, they vastly underestimated the sheer logistical preparation required to fight an empire. They were undeniably brave, but often poorly organized. Historians often refer to their efforts as quixotic heroism.
Quixotic, meaning they were incredibly brave, deeply idealistic, but perhaps they were basically tilting at windmills against the might of the British Empire.
Precisely. However, and this is a massive however for UPSC students, if we look at their longer-term legacy, their movement was a massive, undeniable success.
How so? In what way did they succeed?
They successfully banished the paralyzing fear of British power from the minds of the Indian public. They decisively showed that everyday Indians were completely willing to suffer and die for their country. They kept the vital spirit of active resistance fully alive during a long, stagnant lull in the formal Congress movement. And crucially, most importantly, they directly inspired the entire next generation of freedom fighters. Men like Bhagat Singh, Surya Sen, Chandrasekhar Azad, the great heroes of the 1920s and 30s, they literally grew up idolizing the stories of Khudiram Bose and Kartar Singh Sarabha. I mean, Bhagat Singh notoriously always carried a small photograph of the young martyr Kartar Singh Sarabha right in his shirt pocket.
Wow. So they basically lit the torch that the next more successful generation ultimately carried forward to the finish line.
Precisely. They were the brave pioneers of ultimate sacrifice. And one specific thing about the Gadarites that needs to be highlighted, they were deeply, truly secular in their approach, uniting Sikhs, Hindus, and Muslims. That specific secular legacy was deeply foundational for the later national movement.
Absolutely. It's a legacy definitely worth remembering and honoring. So we've thoroughly unpacked the initial spark. We've traced the regional fires in Bengal, Maharashtra, and Punjab, mapped out the incredible global network, and analyzed the eventual decline. It's been quite an intense journey through this historical pressure cooker.
It really has been. It was a true decade of fire that forged the modern Indian spirit.
Before we sign off today, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over. We spent a lot of time talking about the ambitious German plot and the massive Ghadar uprising plan for 1915. We know it tragically failed due to internal treachery and a lack of tight coordination, but I want you to ask yourself this. If the First World War had gone just slightly differently, or if that massive 1915 uprising simply hadn't been betrayed by that single informer, Kirpal Singh, could Indian independence actually have come 30 whole years earlier?
That is such a fascinating what-if of history, because the British Army inside India was severely depleted at that exact moment. The political situation was incredibly volatile. It really truly hung in the balance for a few weeks there. History often turns on very small, seemingly insignificant hinges.
It really does. Definitely something fascinating to mull over while you revise your notes. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly detailed deep dive into the first phase of revolutionary activities.
It was an absolute pleasure discussing this with you all. Keep studying hard.
Once again, a reminder that this deep dive was brought to you by the Simplified UPSC by PPP YouTube channel. Please, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button right now. It means the absolute world to us and helps us grow.
And if you are financially capable, please support us on Patreon so we can keep bringing you these highly detailed research deep dives week after week.
Don't forget to immediately check the public Telegram channel for those vital free notes and PYQ linkages we mentioned. And for the really serious students aiming for top ranks, the private Telegram library is waiting for you with all the premium organized content. Just shoot us a DM to join.
Like the video, leave a comment down below with your thoughts. We genuinely love hearing your perspectives on these historical events.
A massive, huge shout out to all our current supporters who make all this hard work possible. Until next time, keep reading, keep analyzing,
And keep connecting the dots.
happy learning.